talk to you about in a moment, make this public. And support this dissident culture, which, as you'll see next lecture, 2 lectures from now, actually has some consequence in the subsequent political history of the countries that in question. And if you go on the web, you'll find thousands. I mean, I may exaggerate thousands, but hundreds of reports from Human Rights Watch. Well, there are many other these organizations that engage in the civic and economic part of this. I could just point. Lawyers have been very active in this, in sort of pushing the legal claims of this, and one of the most important of these is the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, which is called Human Rights First, and they work basically on the legal side of human rights protection. And they're explicitly engaged, they say, in promoting respect for the legal protections promised in the Universal Declaration and its subsequent international and multipartite rights legal documents. So they're involved in immigration rights. They were really importantly involved in monitoring and then bringing to bear pressure on Idi Amin in Uganda. So they've been engaged in. They were involved in the Nike boycott. So they started by young lawyers on Wall Street, actually, and then grew. So there's a whole legal version of the story, as well as the sort of lay version that does the watching, and many organizations in between. They monitor our State Department. They monitor in other countries now, and so forth. So I hope you're seeing. I'm not asking you to remember all of these, of course. I'm just trying to give you a sense of the many different versions of international civil society which are coming to being in this period, of the kind of information and material they generate, and of what then it grows out of that in turn. Well, I think I'm going to skip over this because I want to talk about labor with you in particular. But I just want to. We've talked about some of these issues before, so I just want to put these in context. There's other organizations which are interested in the other part of the Declaration, the economic, social, and cultural rights, and they in turn evolve. So we talked a little bit of Physicians for Human Rights, which is one of the most important of these, and they in turn develop splits and become multiple organizations over particular issues. We learned about the witnessing issue. How much is it just the witness, even if you can't help? So they had a split between these groups in 1980, where a group was said, even if we can't help, the Médecins du Monde said it's our role to be there as witnesses. So we're not there first as doctors and then as witnesses. We're there first as witnesses and then as doctors. So, in short, civil society internationally, as civil society nationally, fissures, multiplies, grows along political and cultural lines. Oxfam and the International CARE are another one of these important humanitarian organizations which are engaged in the social and economic cultural rights issue, initially just to provide humanitarian aid, but now much more also interested in development. And in sort of infrastructure necessary to produce cultural and economic rights. So it's not just they go in for emergencies, they also go in for development work. So development work and human rights work clearly overlap in this area. And there's a whole program in this department, in this university, which deals with these issues. And that's, of course, also then engaged in a bunch of political issues, the debate about whether core issues of development are really engaged by these groups. And it's even here in the politics of campus. Why did we start a human rights minor when there already was a poverty development project? The reason is that we thought the poverty development program concentrated too much on just teaching students to produce widgets. That is to say that you just needed to have a clean water pump and you'd be okay. And we're trying to say, well, no, you need to understand more about the cultural, political infrastructure of these countries, about politics, about broader sets of issues than just poverty. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't want to argue now. I just want to say that the question of what it would take to produce these social, cultural, and economic rights is something that's debated in the international arena, and it's debated pedagogically here on campus with right-thinking people on all sides of this issue. So that's the kind of big overview. And now let's look at the story of Jerry Leiber, if you will, at the end. I hope you like the. You don't have to read every word of the book, but I do want you to get a sense of a life in human rights. That's why I wanted you to read it. It makes it concrete. It's a real person doing stuff. I mean, that was my. So I was read it like I wanted you to read it like a novel. I'm asking you to memorize each organization she belonged to. So if you haven't read it, I hope that my little survey will help you read it with some interest. Okay? So you'll notice that the word human rights is actually not used very much in the book, because when she was working on this, human rights was not the kind of word that it has become now. So her story begins really. She tells you a little bit about her background and her dad, but it really begins when she reads an article in the New Republic in 1973 and gets involved in Amnesty and gets involved in Amnesty International. So it's very much a kind of it's a sort of moment that I think you might recognize from the beginning of our course when we talked about Clarkson and anti-slavery. It's a moment when someone says, I need to change my life because I understand that something's different. Someone who's open to changing their life because they realize something's different. So she says, she starts to read an article about torture in the New Republic written by Rose Styron, who was an important writer and the wife of a novelist, Styron, who wrote Nat Turner and a bunch of important books on this. So part of a progressive literary couple. And she says she wanted to put the article down, but she couldn't. I couldn't, and she quotes from the article, in which someone else is offering a report. I saw a man walking hesitantly, leaning on sticks, one eyelid half closed, his mouth twisted, his stomach muscles twitching, unable to form words. Encourage him to talk, if not the Gestapo will kill him. We did not speak, not because we were heroic, but simply because we had nothing to say. And he goes on to talk about people, the article talked about people being tortured in a variety of countries, South Africa, Turkey, India, Ireland, Indonesia, and so forth. And she says this just touched her. And she then met she was invited to meet this woman at a weekend at her summer house, and Rose Styron, tells her about Amnesty International. Says, "Why did you come to a meeting?" So she comes to meeting at Columbia, and then she takes up a case, and she starts writing letters. So there it is, just a moment in which her life changes because she thinks that she's going to be able to make a difference. So you sort of see this pattern that we've had before. We had it with the founding of the Red Cross. Again, we have this pattern of recognition, sense that we can do something about it oneself, local organization and civil society, publicity, and then slowly development of more engagement, elaboration of institution with slow and mixed, but in some sense, a real success. So back to Amnesty then. I just want to say a little bit more about that before I move on. I've given you the story of its founding, but Amnesty in turn then also has a broader set of ramifications, which Leiber gets involved in. She works specifically for a group called the International Freedom to Publish Committee and Fund for Free Expression. They in turn are the people who put out the Index on Censorship, which is a world diary of which countries allow free speech. Index on Censorship is in turn an organization that starts with two Soviet dissidents who write to the Times of London in the late 1960s on behalf of two other writers. So starting with Soviet writers writing the Times, we get this index for censorship, which gets labor connected to it, which connects the index for censorship with Amnesty International. And their view is very much like the Watch view, as well as the human rights, is the Amnesty view. If you expose something, if we have transparency, the world will be better. The tyrants, concealments, this is from the International Freedom to Publish Committee's report. The tyrants, concealments of oppression and of absolute cruelty should always be challenged. There should be noise of publicity outside every detention center and concentration camp, and a published report of every tyrannical denial of free expression. And it applies both to the group attacked both right-wing dictatorships and communist states and newly independent African states. So like Amnesty, it spread its views widely. Okay, so she works for this International Freedom of Expression group in 1977, and then, as you know, she gets involved with working for Watch. She gets involved with that specifically by meeting Aryeh Neier, who is now president, or retiring president of the Soros Foundation, the Open Society Fund, and who was, for a time, also director of the American Civil Liberties Union. In other words, he's a bureaucrat, would put it unkindly. He's a professional engaged in this kind of human rights civil society, engaged in civil liberties, in openness on a national as well as the international stage. So in page 129, she ends up meeting Aryeh Neier, who's founding the America's Watch, and asks her, will you come and join me? So she ends up then joining him and becoming a member of one of these watch organizations. These watch organizations, I think, are then funded by the Ford Foundation. That brings you back to this earlier thing I mentioned, how new funding makes this possible, connects with other watch organizations around the world, and then organizations like Charter 77, which is a Czech group of writers, we'll talk about next time, but part of dissident culture, with Solidarity, which is part of the Polish labor movement, a sort of left Catholic movement. We'll talk about this more, and with other Eastern European movements, and with movements in the opposing right-wing Latin American dictatorships. Right? So in other words, I hope you can see now in her life, she starts with one, she moves to the other, she gets involved in the third one. So she joins up with Aryeh Neier, who, as I say, becomes head of the ACLU, and then she begins this rather brave life that you'll see in the book of just travel around the world, of meeting these people and of linking these people together. So international human rights and human rights in general is actually made by people who are devoting their lives to making these connections, to creating the opportunities for producing pressure, for creating. I want to think of this as an infrastructure of politics, not politics, but an infrastructure for an infrastructure of politics, and pressuring other people to travel. Intelligently. So she goes to the Soviet Union, she meets these dissidents, she then pressures the State Department. Well, we get right here. So she makes these links around the world. She then travels, pushes the State Department to speak on behalf of these organizations. I mean, I'm going to just point you to page 238 and 239 when you read. It's a nice little section where she